All right. So we are here today. I'm here co-hosting with Joseph Lear. Joseph, it's good to meet you. We've never actually met in person. But, you know, chit-chatted over the
Um,
Substack back channels, but first time to talk.
it's
We
fun to
we
hang
are
out with you both.
yeah. I think this is gonna be a lot of fun. We are here today with a very special edition of Substack Live. We're going to be talking about this book, In Defense of Evangelicalism. Comes out September 1st, right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. We're here with Bonnie Kristian, the author of what I think is going to be one of the most hotly discussed books of the last part of 2026. I don't know
We'll
how else to
see.
say it. It's really good, and very it's very spicy. So I think that's the combination of things is going to lend for hopefully a really good discussion. So, first up, Bonnie, why don't you introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit about this book?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for having me. So I am at present the deputy editor at Christianity Today, which on our team is second in command of the newsroom. I have been with CT on staff for 3 years, and then for about 3.5 years before that, I was a columnist. I've been in journalism for over a decade now. Started working my way into the field while I was in seminary, and then gradually ramped up my publications and experience. Most of the other places I've written for have been secular media, and so coming to CT has been really fascinating and really put me in the world of evangelicalism. Whereas in a lot of my prior um, roles or like robust repeated freelancing gigs, I would be sort of uh, talking about evangelicalism to a wider world that may perhaps couldn't be assumed to know that much about it. So it's been curious to be on the other side of things there. This book, uh, the idea for it, I think, was about a year and a half ago, like maybe January of last year, early last year. I had been talking about a different book idea with my editor, and we kind of started talking about this. And I had some. He was gung ho from the beginning. I had some more trepidation. Um, Thinking about, as Miles said, like this is a spicy topic, and as much as an opinion writer, like I'm not scared of controversy, but I'm not someone who goes out and like seeks fights on the internet. I was a little bit spicier in my early 20s, and I feel like I kind of aged out of that for the most part. Um, but the more I thought about it and prayed about it, and um, I just came to the conclusion that, well, for one thing, I had already written, and I kind of went back and found in my archives, I had already written some things that were moving in this direction, and I hadn't really even clocked in myself this pattern of thought, and this
Mhm.
sense that there was something that needed to be said. And so sort of like seeing that in my own work was helpful to think about, of, oh, this isn't actually truly novel ground for me. And then, yeah, I just sort of came to the conclusion of like, it does need to be said. And if I have the capacity and, especially because of my role at CT, sort of the unique opportunity to do it, uh, then perhaps I should.
Yeah. You're very uniquely positioned to be able to write about this topic in a way that I think very few people are. Because that's not so on the one hand, you're not simply working from like anecdotal observations that what Joseph and I would have. We're just kind of seeing like what happens in our particular spaces. But neither are you really like uh a mouthpiece for like you're not a like a mouthpiece for evangelical, like you're a journalist.
Mm.
And so your role is to try to accurately describe what it is that's there rather than always to like uncritically promote it or something like that. Or to
Yeah,
feel
I
like you
mean,
have a really unique place to be able to write about this topic.
I have at least one early reader I can think of right now who I know for her, as she goes through this book, a lot of her experience is going to be finding out about, oh, there's some real bad things in evangelicalism's history
Mm, yeah.
that she didn't know about. Um, and I'm very uninterested in hiding those things or downplaying those things. Um, Many of the works that I critically engage, I would still say, for many people, this is actually good reading for you to do. Some of the conclusions I think are overwrought, but a lot of the information actually quite important for us to know about our background and the state of our movement today. Um, but yeah, I think a big challenge of it was to not respond to history and data with anecdote and not to say like, "Oh,
Mhm.
but my church friends are nice," because that's not a sufficient pushback,
Yeah.
right? Like, that's not like, that's true, my church friends are nice, but that's not a defense of evangelicalism. And so a big challenge was to dig into the history and to look at, large scale data and to talk to a broad swath of people both on the ground and with kind of big picture academic expertise and say, like, are you seeing the same thing that I'm seeing? Or is this just kind of like my narrow vantage point?
Yeah. So what
Yeah.
is this book? Go ahead, Joseph.
Um,
Well, I was just going to add that I also think that those anecdotes in the book that you share about particular individuals that you interviewed, just like uh, you know, are actually extremely important to the project. Nevertheless, right? Like
mhm,
it's not just a bird's eye view of like
mhm.
massive trends, but like getting
Yeah,
down into the nitty gritty.
yeah,
Like people forget that there are real stories out there that buck every statistical trend,
mhm,
and salting and peppering the whole book with those things really yeah, puts contours on all of those stats that you and others have shared along the way.
yeah. I mean, I'm hoping, especially for readers who are coming to this less familiar with evangelicalism, whether because, they're sort of just like a well-intentioned news consumer who's like, "I've heard all these bad things about these people. I should know what's going on here. Maybe I'll give this a shake." Or because, and I think this is, um, true and not a very flattering truth about evangelicalism, that we often grow up in kind of our own little corner and we don't necessarily know what the broader movement and situation is like, right? And maybe that's less common with modern media, but I think that still happens. And so, yeah, I think it is important to let people actually meet a specific person and hear, from their own mouths why they did what they did, and what their thinking is and what matters to them.
Mhm. Well, why don't we start with okay, so tell us a bit about like what exactly is this book doing? And also, what is this book not trying to do? 'Cause I think there's a
um,
lot of people when they saw this is a defense of
yeah.
evangelicalism, it raises the specter that you're trying to like but you're not, as you just said, like you're not trying to like dismiss all of the anti evangelical critiques. You're not trying
Mhm.
to whitewash a history. You're not trying to do any of that. But what
Yeah.
is this book and what is it not?
Yeah. Um, So let me start with what it is. So there's 5 core chapters. The introduction is significantly focused on sort of establishing why this book, and then also what do we mean when we say evangelical? Like, who are we talking about here? Because that's very contested, both in kind of public discourse and then also in academic studies of this right now. Like, it's a big conversation. So my quite a long introduction is basically a full chapter. I'm sorry about that. I thought they would have put it in with the other chapters, and instead you're going to get in there and be like, "Wow, we are in these Roman numerals for a long time." Um, but the 5 core chapters are examining 5 common arguments that are made about evangelicals in America, um, and I'm sort of envisioning them as like they flow into one another, where you can imagine an interlocutor kind of seeding one point and then stepping back to the next, and okay, now we have to address this one. And in each case, I have really sincerely tried to find like credible people to engage.
Mm,
This is not a lot of people are saying somebody did some mean tweets about us. It is people who have real expertise, who have real influence, who have large followings, who have really successful books. Um, because I think, it is in some cases, they are bringing like important critiques to the table. And I think maybe then going a bit too far in their conclusions. And then in other cases, it's just like, this is who people are listening to. And so it's important to actually address the real thing and not just make up a guy to be mad at. So the 5 chapters, the 5 charges are insincerity, that we're just tribal. It's not really about, like, we're not actually that serious about the beliefs. We're really just about like ourselves as a group. The second one is evil, that we are about the beliefs, but the beliefs themselves are bad. The third one is hypocrisy, that, the beliefs are not bad, they're good, but we're just always betraying them. The fourth one is imposition. So this is the notion that we are trying to impose our beliefs. Maybe we're not even hypocritical about them, but we're trying to impose them on other people in public life who don't want that. And this is really focused on sort of like what I would call the private sector public square. Like, it's not about politics proper, so much as all the other ways we interact in society. And then the fifth one is about control, specifically political control. This notion that whenever evangelicals start engaging in politics, it's just seeking for power. It's Christian nationalism. It's the New Apostolic Reformation. It's just this idea, this quest for dominance over our fellow citizens. So those are the five arguments that I'm addressing, and I'm sure if anyone who follows evangelicalism in the news, you've probably heard some version of all of those arguments, often together, even when it might not make sense. I feel like sometimes from the same writer, you'll see both the evil charge and the hypocrisy charge, and it's like, well, ideally you would pick one. What the book is not trying to do is, as I said, paper over anything, downplay anything. This is a movement of tens of millions, like by any way you count it, tens of millions of people in America. And that's even deliberately, to a degree, setting aside evangelicals in the past and in other parts of the world today, because as much as I think it's important to recognize that evangelicalism is something bigger and broader than American evangelicalism in 2026, American evangelicalism in 2026 is the point of contention. And so I don't think it's a legitimate move from my defense to just sort of like hide us behind those other people.
I
So
appreciated that, actually. I
yeah,
appreciated
I
like not saying, well, there's these other really great
yes.
people over here, and you should just
Yeah.
let them be the representatives.
No, I mean, it has to be like, that's a cop out. It has to be about us, because we are the ones at issue, and especially, specifically white American evangelicalism. So yeah, it's not trying to dodge, it's not trying to cover up. In many, many cases, especially when I'm thinking about the historians whom I'm engaging, I can look at like the vast majority of their work, the history focused part, as opposed to the more argument and conclusion part, and say like, yeah, you're right, that bad stuff happened, and it was bad. Like, I agree. So yeah, that's, I think, the single biggest thing I'm not trying to do. And then if I can zag back to what I am trying to do, um, I talked about hoping for readers who are not very familiar with evangelicalism, that they will come to it and that it'll be useful and intelligible to them. But I am also hoping for evangelicals that, so like, I have a friend at church who has an early copy. And she's, I think, the early reader who has most explicitly articulated this, but I've heard something quite close, or like reading in between the lines from many other early readers as well. A sense that it was, again, not denying the bad stuff, but like validating or a sense of relief, I think, is the right way to put it. That this dissonance that many evangelicals feel when they look at their church that they're at every Sunday, and they're like, this is good and normal, and we are not doing abuses here, and we are not, doing a political rally from the pulpit. But then they look out at the news, and it's so common to see evangelicalism painted as if we were all some crazy person church, that it has been a great relief to be able to see like, oh no, actually my church was more the median experience, and I don't have to feel bad about my church and my faith, and I can uh, call this good thing that I know to be good. I can call it good in public, and it's okay.
Yeah. Just before we get too far away from it, can you say a bit about the subtitle of the book? I know
Yes, the
lots and lots
subtitle
of people
has
have had
yes,
questions
lots
about
of
that.
questions. Yeah, so the subtitle is a response to its culture despisers. I can't speak. A response to its culture despisers. It is heavily borrowing from a German liberal Protestant theologian named Friedrich Schleiermacher. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, a scholar of his work. I read some in seminary,
Mhm.
sort of in, I think it was like in a historical survey class of like, this is an important figure. Um, his theology, very far afield from mine in many ways, but the the reason I chose this for the subtitle to sort of borrow from him is twofold. One is I think it's intelligible whether you know the reference or not, and communicates something important about the dynamics of many of these critiques. But two is that if you the great bulk of this is from a book he wrote, um, responding to religion in general, religion's culture despisers, and it if you get into the text, like, he's dealing with different arguments, it's a different culture, it's a different situation. But the basic premise of, you know, there are, well-educated and, culturally elite people in our society who have, in his case, he said, You have reached a point of thinking that you don't need religion anymore. It's not something you need to bother with, and you still like sort of the tangible social benefits of it. You like our art and our poets, and, you hang the Last Supper in your house because you think it's beautiful, but you don't think it's true. You don't think it has any claim on you. Maybe even you like the ethics and the society that the ethics of Jesus produced, right? But you don't really. It's not tied to the divinity of Christ or any kind of religious observance. And you look down upon the people who do continue to practice religion. He says, if you wanted to learn about any other sphere of life, you would go to the people who practice it and you would talk to them and you would find out what their deal is. But when it comes to religion, the last person you'll treat as credible is a preacher. Um, and so, there are real differences here, but I think that that class dynamic and that sense of treating the people under discussion as not credible and not to be taken seriously when they speak to their own beliefs. That feels very similar to me. And also, on the first page of his book, he just has this sort of exasperated sense of like, I didn't want to do this, but you guys kind of
But,
forced my hand,
yeah,
and
guess
I
we're doing
that
this.
that was very familiar.
Yep. Yep. No, I know that feeling. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we start with maybe some basics here. One of the things that the book I think is doing is trying to sort out when we're talking about evangelicals, who are we talking about? And a lot of this, as you get into in the first chapter, has to do with questions of how people self-identify as evangelicals, or the way in which this information is captured in surveys or data, or like large scale data. Um, who are we talking about when we're talking about evangelicals?
Yeah, well, I mean, the reason this is half of my functionally a long chapter is it is difficult to sort out, and I deliberately did not want to give a super succinct description or definition so much as a description. Um, Self-identification is, as you mentioned, the thing that is most often used in surveys, and especially political surveys. There are like more religiously focused, faith-focused polling organizations that will do things in a more detailed way, like looking at denominational affiliation and how often you go to services and what you actually believe. And so those can be more precise numbers. And depending on how intensely you sort of filter things down, you can end up with wildly different numbers of how many people in America are evangelicals. But the self ID is the most common measure, and by that measure, you end up with like 20 to 25% of the country, like a big chunk of people. My argument is that while that is often, sufficient for seeing like kind of those big picture political trends, um, it's not great. And the one of the single biggest tells on this is this has only gotten attention in the Trump era, but it actually predates Trump. It starts at least in 2012, and I suspect earlier, that there are people who are atheists or of other, like, actively practicing other faiths who will tell pollsters that, yes, they're evangelical. And so this has sort of been cast as, like, in the Trump era, as, oh, like, evangelicalism is actually just about politics, and we always knew it, and here's the proof. Um, no, number one, it predates Trump, and number two, those people are wrong. In fact, like, just because some people are under the like, don't know what a word means, that doesn't mean they get to, like, sort of unilaterally change the definition over the objections of millions of people who actually practice this faith. So sort of the most, and I want to say, like, this is necessarily inadequate, but, like, the most succinct definition that I would give is that an evangelical is a creedally orthodox Protestant Christian. Um, that evangelicals have a shared history and, crucially, culture that dates back to the First Great Awakening, and that our beliefs and practice, not just like things in the brain, our beliefs and practice are oriented around the four emphases known as the Bebbington Quadrilateral. This is a rubric that a scholar named David Bebbington came up with in the 1980s that was very quickly was like widely adopted, became sort of the universal description to accept, or especially more recently to critique and sort of, build your new model against. And so he says that evangelicals emphasize individual conversion, social activism, the Bible, and the cross. And he's very clear that this is, again, not just about what you think is important. It's about what how you live, what you do, what shapes your
Mm.
life, and also that these are things. These are obviously not exclusive emphases to evangelicals, right? Like Catholics also into the Bible, but that other branches of the church have other things that they emphasize in the day-to-day practice of their faith in a way that we don't. So, for example, with Catholics, taking the Eucharist and having it be the real presence, that is a more distinctive Catholic emphasis and not something that we emphasize in evangelicalism in the same way, even though, yes, there are some evangelicals who believe in real presence.
Right. So how does this help us to how does that you've described like some of the complications here and
Yeah.
some of the stuff that creates noise in the data.
Mhm.
Um, one of the big questions that always, like as you read the note, that always surfaces is the 81%, right?
Mhm.
That if you're looking for a quick and easy way to define like what evangelicals do, it's this 81% number that
Mhm.
voted for President Trump. How does what you're describing? How does that maybe help us to see that commonly deployed stat, maybe in a different kind of way?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing to say off the bat is that's a self ID number. That's
Mm,
people who told a pollster that they're evangelical. They may or may not know what that means. Um, I think certainly we can say, like, most of them probably are Christians of some kind, right? But there is, as these repeated polls have shown, decent subset of folks who will claim the label and just there's no such thing as an evangelical atheist. Like, I'm sorry, but there's just not. Um, so there's things like that. There's like the inherent problem of self ID built into that poll. The other thing that is very often missed in the way that number is, the phrasing of people reporting that number, is that is 81% of the white evangelicals, self ID evangelicals, who voted in 2016. In fact,
Yeah.
just like other Americans, about 40% of evangelicals didn't vote for either person for president that year. And when you factor that in, voting for Trump is actually a slight, I think it's still the plurality choice, but it's a slight minority choice of like 48% voted for Trump in 2016. The other slight majority, like 52%, I think, I'd have to recheck my own math, either didn't vote, or that's that 40%, or they voted, it's the 19% that voted for someone else. So I think that that's important to think about. There are other ways to nuance that as well, and it's kind of difficult to relay all of the numbers stuff
yeah.
verbally, and so you have to get the book to get into that. But I mean, similar to the thing about global evangelicalism, like, yes, that exists, and yes, I think it's important to nuance that number and to understand what we're actually talking about. And so I do make those points in the book. But again, like, the point of contention is not that 40% that didn't vote or that 19% that voted for someone else. It is that 48% or 81% of voters who went for Trump. And so the nuance is good, but like to do an actual defense, it has to come back to the 81%.
Okay.
I think that
So, yeah, go
one of
ahead.
the lovely things is that self ID problem runs in both directions, and you
Mhm.
helpfully point that out too with like the Black church in America,
Mhm.
but also your own family members. Like you mentioned that your mother didn't know that she was an
Yes.
evangelical, right? And so
Yeah.
you might actually have a self ID problem, a
Mhm.
profound one, when people are coming out and are asked, "Are you an evangelical?" They may have never heard that term. In fact, I would guess that most people in my church would probably say no to that, even though they
Yep.
fit the category
Yes.
almost totally.
Yeah, it's really common, I think, and that's hard to fathom, I suspect, for people like us and probably most of the people who are listening who are on the internet a lot. Like, I would say if you are active enough on Substack to know how to do a Substack live on either side of the equation, that probably sounds crazy, but it is true.
Yeah.
The historian Thomas Kidd talks about this. He says evangelicalism or evangelical has long been a word of journalists and of academics. And who is doing all this discourse? It's journalists and academics, but the people out in the pews overwhelmingly tend to identify by their denomination. Or if they're non-denominational, they may simply say Christian, or especially in older generations, you might hear like Christian, not Catholic. Got to specify that.
Yeah.
um, or you might hear like my mom will call herself a born again, like as a noun. Um, or some people will still trot out the fundamentalist label or like a conservative Christian. They're trying to communicate that they don't know the term, but they're trying to communicate that they're not a mainline Protestant. So I think those kinds of words are more common among people who are not terminally online to this day. In my mom's case, yes. I mean, she's a lifelong, not lifelong, but through her whole adulthood, she has been in indisputably evangelical churches. And when I told her I was writing the book, she was like pumped for me. And then she was like, okay, but what is an evangelical? And
Yeah.
it had not crossed her mind that this was a label for her. And you mentioned the Black church. This is a similar, I think, really important thing to note about the polls, which is that when they're doing self ID, if they know that you are Black, they automatically sort you out of evangelicalism. And so, and this happens in different ways. Sometimes if it's affiliation with a historically Black tradition, that's what gets sorted out, even though many historically Black traditions are very evangelical in lots of ways. Sometimes it is, they just want to separate out white evangelicals as a category. So they're just doing a straightforward racial sorting. Um, when you ask people, though, and then also, I mean, the other thing is that many Black Christians in America are not comfortable with the label evangelical because they do understand it as a white thing. And so they will not identify with that. But if you expand it and ask evangelical or born again, because the born again label does not have the political connotations that evangelical does now, you will get a yes at higher proportions from Black Christians than from white Christians.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have these 5 criticisms that you've laid out on the table here.
Mhm.
Of the 5, which of these was for you like the hardest to write about?
Mm.
I think the hypocrisy charge is the
Mm,
strongest,
mm,
um, and the one that has a real measure of truth in it. I mean, it probably won't come as any surprise that as an evangelical, I don't think that we don't care about our beliefs, actually, and I don't think that our beliefs are bad. I mean, if I thought that they were bad, presumably I wouldn't still be evangelical, right? I'd go do something else. But the hypocrisy charge, I think there is truth to that. Um, and the two pieces that the chapter focuses on, because this is what the or conversations are about. It's in supporting Donald Trump, and it's on issues of race. And I think that some of the critics who come after us on this, um, while making like truly very valid points. And I have written many things, particularly about evangelicals and Trump. People can go back and find my archives, and while certainly, anyone who writes a lot, if you're looking at something from 10 years ago, it's like, "Oh, well, I wouldn't say it quite like that today."
Mm.
But it's like that normal level of writerly shift and, like, preference and hopefully increased skill. Like, it's not like, "Oh, I don't believe this anymore. I actually love Donald Trump and I need to retract all this." I don't want to retract all that. I still think, he is a terrible president and that we should not be associated with him like this. Um, but at the same time as I've made some of these critiques, and I grant, some of these critiques on both the Trump issue and on the race issue, I think the conclusions that are drawn, these sort of sweeping, like, this, uh, this is the sum of the movement is just like
Mm.
people who love
Yeah.
Donald Trump and hate minorities. That is not true.
Mm.
And also the very pessimistic conclusions that, particularly on race, like I understand why people land in that space, um, but it's just not true that we have not made progress. I mean, even in my life,
Mhm.
I have personally witnessed substantial shifts on things like interracial marriage, on things like how we talk about Martin Luther King. And I think it's impossible to look at the state, like, not that it's a linear progress, right? Like sometimes things get worse and then they get better again. But I think it is impossible to look at the state of race relations in American evangelicalism today and look back at 1950 and say, oh, it's nothing's getting better. We can still be hypocritical at times and still have real work to do, but it's just not true that this is like the one sin that Christ can't overcome, and that is the way that people very commonly speak about it.
One of the most powerful ways in which you work through the book is and you do this, I think, in a couple of different chapters, is you use the relative to what
Mhm,
kind of description with respect to like all of the different issues that are raised with respect to evangelicals, like with respect to gender. You spend a lot of time in chapter 2 talking about evangelicals and the relationship to gender,
mhm,
and you work through and really I don't know, can I say take to task or critique? You critique very vigorously some of the more prominent accounts of evangelicals and gender which have been written
mhm,
in the last few years.
mhm,
Um, and so, but I think that move of relative to what is a really
mhm,
is a helpful one,
mhm,
because it allows you to kind of say, yeah, like look at where things were in the 1950s, look at the
mhm,
treatment of women in the like the early 1500s. Like this is not what we're talking about, right?
mhm.
Um, go ahead, Joseph. You're
I
Yeah.
well, just to add to that, I took particular relish in the reverse hypocrisy bit where
Mm.
you should just like, say a few words about that and take your own thunder on that because that was
yeah,
excellent.
it was
Yeah, so
very good.
that's a section where I talk about this pattern that I've observed and several people I interviewed have also observed in evangelicals, which is when you get them face to face with a member of some group that white evangelicals ostensibly are hateful toward, someone of a different race, an immigrant, a poor person, they are like falling all over themselves to be helpful and to be gracious and to be kind. And then when they're not face to face, the things they are saying is just like, "Whew, can you can we not speak this way
Yeah.
about people?" And so it's like the common model of hypocrisy is that someone will say good things and then go do bad things that violate that. And this pattern that I see and that other people told me they see is like when they are in that political mode, they are talking like Rush Limbaugh, like, there is a real unkindness there, but then they go and do good things, and so, like, there is obviously a just significant option or place for sanctification here, for growth here, for consistency here, right? Like, James is super clear about this, like, with the same mouth you bless God and you curse your neighbor, this should not be, but as to Myles' point, like, the question is compared to what? And so, do I want people to be saying mean things and doing good things? I mean, no, that's not ideal. I would rather them be saying good things and doing good things. But I would rather have that interpersonal kindness, than doing bad and saying bad. Um, and that this is where that question of compared to what comes in, because it's not just sort of like my anecdote and my feeling that when we are dealing with, like, quite politically and culturally conservative Americans, that evangelicalism does actually make them better in those tangible ways. This is something that the historian Daniel K. Williams has studied, as particularly, like, he's looked at white Southern evangelicals when they leave church and cease to be practicing evangelicals. Um, they don't become like nice liberals. They have all of the same, um, like, conservative and often populist instincts, but without the tethering to community and to, like, taking care of the real person in front of them. And this is also something that that book, The Great Dechurching, looks at, where they have studied this, at the survey scale, at the data scale, people who remain in church. Again, maybe they're not, people lie to pollsters, people overestimate how good they are. But when you ask them things like, is it important to care for the needy? Is it important to, tangibly help the immigrant and the refugee, and to, be kind to people and oppose racism? It is about a 20-point gap, where people who stay in church are far more likely to say that, yes, we need to do all these things, and people who leave become about 20 points less likely to say it. And it's remarkable because it's not even 20 points less likely to do it. They just don't even feel the compunction to, like, tell a pollster, yeah, I think it's good to oppose racism. And so this is where, like, this question of comparison comes in. Like, evangelicalism, being an evangelical, being engaged in a local evangelical church does not pluck you out of your social context, your political context. It does not make you a blank slate, like, that just gets imprinted with only, like, the most pure and instantly sanctified soul. I'm sorry to the Methodists who might disagree, but about the viability of that scenario. Um, but you are still who you are in the culture that you're in. But the measurable evidence, and you may still be doing, like, what I described as that sort of inverse hypocrisy, um, but the measurable evidence is that it does make you treat your neighbor better.
Yeah. Um, what for you was the most surprising part about writing this? Like, what did you discover in the process of offering a defense of evangelicalism that you weren't anticipating finding?
Hmm. I think maybe I would point to chapter the 5th chapter that talks about, like, people seeking political control. Um,
Mhm. This is the chapter
there's
that you get into the whole Christian nationalist conversation
yes,
and how
yeah,
we like whether or not evangelicals are consistently like
hmm
high on the scale of
hmm
being ranked for Christian nationalism, right?
yeah, yeah. And so I was, sort of generally familiar with the major books in that genre, that have really shaped the discourse there, and with the work of the people who wrote them. I hadn't gotten into them in detail before. And when I got into, in particular, there's this Baylor University survey that's been very widely used to measure this. Um, I was I was surprised by how badly designed it was. I didn't I was kind of shocked by how badly designed it was, and
Yeah.
how little, it seemed like anyone had considered, these questions that you're asking people, do they agree or disagree, are actually, really fuzzy and able to be understood in really different ways. Um, but, of course, you're not gonna have that extended conversation with the pollster about, like, "Well, what do you mean by this?" Right?
What do you
It's,
mean
"Can you
by
please pick a number?"
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think it's remarkable, given how messy the data will be from a survey of that type, how definitively the results have been presented as, like,
Mhm.
Christian nationalism is sweeping the nation, like, that Baptist church on the corner, they're about to do a coup, and it's just not a position that is, able to be defended from this data.
My Baptist church is full of a bunch of older people. They're not they're not doing that. Yeah.
They don't have the energy for it.
No, no, no. They do a lot of other good things, but they don't do coos.
Yeah, and I mean,
Um,
I think all of us would agree, like, you should not do Christian nationalism, like, that is a bad thing. I don't want
yeah,
there
let's
to
not do
be
that.
a lot of Christian nationalists in this country,
But
but it's also bad to suggest that there's more of them than there are, and it gives aid and
this is
comfort to them, the real ones.
this is the unfortunate catch that I feel like happens with a lot of these surveys is that good surveys have really complicated results
They're not
that
very
don't
fun.
fit that don't fit
Mhm,
neatly into a headline,
Mhm,
right? And
mhm,
so in some ways, you want to simplify these surveys so that the results will be marketable on the other side. So you're
mhm.
thinking about that ahead of time. But of course, to your point, that ends up with all this like sloppiness that like lumps people together in ways that are baked into the way questions are answered. And we're not really getting any closer to the truth and is the true sign of the unfortunate supremacy of statistics in the way we think about all things.
Yeah.
Bonnie,
I have a
go ahead.
question.
Go for it.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you, Miles, if you have a litany that you're getting through there, but I do have
Nope.
something that I want to throw out there,
Okay.
which is first of all, I want to say that I loved the book.
Mhm,
It was fantastic. It was beautiful. And one of the anxieties I know that a lot of authors have, so this is a compliment not just for you, but for the audience to understand how important the book is that this live thing that we're doing and any other podcast that you might do cannot fully encapsulate what's going on in the book.
mm.
So like there are innumerable books out there where you listen to the podcast and you're like, well, I feel like
I
I've
got it.
basically read the book
Yep.
now. Not the
Mhm,
case with this book, Bonnie.
mhm,
Um, as you said, each chapter is cumulative of like
mhm,
these charges, and I
mhm,
loved, you talk about that implicit interlocutor that you
mhm,
have, and
Mhm,
at the end of each chapter, I was like, oh yes, this is the next question that I have, and she
mhm.
just articulated it for me in a little blurb right under the chapter number, but and
mm.
title, which was
Yeah.
particularly fantastic. So what I'm saying is to everyone who is on this live feed, you need to go buy your copy and you should give one to someone for
Mhm.
Christmas. Okay, everybody. So just, buy Bonnie's book. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Uh,
It's something that makes me a little bit nervous, honestly, and more than maybe my last 2 books to be doing things like this and be doing podcasts because there are so many cases in the book where the details of what someone else wrote or what the numbers are, like, the details are really important and something
Mhm.
that's quite difficult to relay with sufficient precision verbally, so thank you for your
Right.
plug.
yeah.
Yeah, there's
So
every chapter is, like, chock full of statistics and close reading of again, without naming any names, but lots of, like, very well-known criticisms and best-selling books from the last several years,
and
um,
personal interviews,
Mhm.
personal
like
interviews.
real live people that Bonnie talked to who are so wonderful to hear in their own words.
Yeah, and
It's great.
who are very different and in some ways more typical evangelicals than me, right? Like,
Mhm,
um, being someone who, as we were talking about earlier, like uses the word evangelical, who is a journalist, who is in all this online discourse, or even the kind of like I'm in an Anglican church. We do liturgy and we do not have smoke machines. Um, and I think it's important to hear from like what I'm trying to do here is not sort of uh, Kristen Covey-Sune has a great phrase. She talks about evangelical gerrymandering. I don't want to do that and sort of carve out
Mhm.
like the nice evangelicals who are
mhm,
like me and defend them, because they have my good politics. And I think if I did do that, I would be defending like a somewhat, in some ways, atypical subset of American
right,
evangelicals. And so I thought it was really important to
Yeah.
hear from people who are going to quite different kinds of evangelical churches than I do, and who are voting different ways and thinking different ways and living in, clear across the country. Because it's important to think about not only um, And this is something I talk about in that introductory chapter, but not only like, is someone an evangelical? That is or isn't question, but are they more or less evangelical? And then within the American context, like, are they more or less typical of American evangelicalism? Because many, many of the fights that we have, I think, are about people who are less typical, and movements and organizations that are less typical, maybe very loud, maybe very prominent, but that does not make them like the median. If you can think back to like high school um,
Mhm.
statistics or algebra, mean, median, and mode, um, they may be prominent. That does not make them the norm.
Yes. I think that was a very important point that comes through repeatedly in the book,
Mhm.
is that very noisy and outsized kinds of things tend to can they cast an unhelpful vision over the tens of millions of people that you're trying to account for here, in ways that give us a fairly distorted vision of what is happening. It's not like, so you're not writing a book that says these bad things happened, but look at all the good things, and like that
Yeah.
somehow balances out all the terrible things. It's trying to give a complicated, much more nuanced picture of
Mhm.
what is on the ground. So I
Yeah.
appreciate
So,
that very
so
much.
let me ask you this, Bonnie.
Yeah.
I hope this is okay because it goes a little bit beyond the book, but this is the
Okay.
question that I wanted to throw at you and just
The fun part of doing live
came up
stuff.
with.
If
So
it's
Here we go.
bad,
so
I'm
if I
just
put
gonna end it and run away.
Nice.
so if I put on my like critical theorist hat
Yeah.
about race, gender,
Mhm.
capitalism, and so on, I think that you point out that the vast majority of evangelicals don't live in the United States, and I understand that you wanted this book to be about white evangelicals. That's the topic, but
Mhm.
white evangelicalism is still the object of criticism when it comes to the criticism of evangelicalism across the globe.
Mhm.
Um, to the extent that right, that
Mm.
like your chapter on imposition, evangelicalism is fundamentally a missionary movement.
Mhm.
I mean, there are a number of denominations like the Assemblies of God, where I am, or the Christian Missionary Alliance. It's all baked into the title on that one, right? That they were founded as missionary movements, first and foremost, to bring the gospel to other countries.
Yeah.
And so there's that question of, is missions, right?
Mhm.
Uh, Deploying the post-colonial critique, is missions itself another form of this imposition? How would you respond to that? And I'm
Mhm.
also curious if, I mean, one of the ways in which I might, at least rhetorically, respond to that is to say, well, if 9 out of 10 evangelicals live outside the United States and you're only criticizing white evangelicalism, then doesn't that betray a neocolonial mindset in your own self?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the obvious things to say, and that this isn't original to me. Many people have said it. The evangelicals of what's commonly called the global South tend to be very socially conservative, to use it like sort of American language. They are going to be pro-life and have traditional sexual ethics, just like most white American evangelicals do. And yes, maybe that is substantially because we evangelized them, and we brought over those perspectives on scripture, and then sort of the ethical perspectives that in our view flows from that, right? It's also, and this is the thing that's not original to me, like kind of insulting and infantilizing to suggest that these hundreds of millions of people elsewhere in the world are not able to think about these things for themselves and examine scripture for themselves and read other books. We are, as much as there are many things to deplore in the history of like excesses and abuses in missionary endeavors, those things absolutely exist. Um, we are also several generations off at this point, kind of like, I mean, more than several, the colonial era of missions. Um, Many of these evangelical communities elsewhere in the world are at this point very well established. They have come into their own. They are run by local leaders. It's not the white missionary in the pulpit anymore. And so I think a certain amount of respect has to be accorded to them. And you might not like what they think. That doesn't mean that they were just duped by us and passed on uncritically for, at this point, generations, what they heard from those initial missionaries. In my own denomination, the ACNA, the Anglican Church in North America, the bulk of our like governing body of bishops are people from the global south. We are under their authority. Like, so the idea that we're controlling them at this point, even at like a tangible organizational level, it's just not true. Um, and I think particularly as religious observance continues to decline, and maybe God will intervene and there's a revival, but just looking sort of at a human sense at the way the trends are running, um, the bulk of Christians are overseas, and that's where the growth is. It's not here. We are not, in that sense, the future of the church, and not going to be the ones setting the terms of the debate, except insofar as we are the ones who are loud on the internet, and so we continue to talk about ourselves. Um, the other thing I would say is, I mean, this is um, a version of sort of like the basic objection to what's increasingly called proselytizing. We would call it evangelism. And this is something that I address in the book. One, probably in my entire career as a journalist, the worst blowback I've ever gotten was suggesting that someone who had talked about evangelism in public. And it by his own account of what he did, it sounded pretty obnoxious and like not something that I would endorse. And I wrote like, it seems like this guy sucks, but evangelism itself is not always bad. And in fact, like that's something that we're like, maybe not every individual person all the time, but like that is something we're kind of required by our faith to do. And it's well intended. And again, seems like this guy sucks, but like don't write the whole thing off because of his shenanigans. And oh man, were people angry. So angry. I think and angry at me from the left. I think the only even comparable blowback I've gotten was when I went after QAnon very early. And those people were like up in my Instagram comments on pictures of my kids. Those are the two things. But I honestly, I do get it. I understand why people have this basic discomfort with evangelism, and truly, many people do it really poorly. I think that there is a real generational dynamic here. I don't think I know anyone my age who is willing to like chat up the gas station clerk in the way that some Christians of older generations will, for better and worse, right? Like maybe sometimes God wants you to chat up the gas station clerk. Maybe sometimes you should buy your chips and get out. So like I get it. I think evangelicals in particular have been really obnoxious to many Jewish people. Like that is a specific pattern of evangelism gone wrong. I do think like presenting my most sympathetic understanding of it, it's that there is number one, like a sense of kinship and like I just like it's just you're so close that evangelicals feel, and then also it's someone who is like visibly a different religion if they're observant and are wearing visible signs of that, and so for the would be eager evangelist, it's like, oh, here's someone who definitely doesn't go to church. But again, like the basic concept of evangelism, for all the caveats about how we have done it badly, both at that like sort of interpersonal scale and at like the like colonial era abusive scale. If you think that the gospel is true, I mean, there is some compulsion to let people know about that, and it's not an ill-intended thing. In fact, it's deeply well-intended, and maybe it's annoying for other people, but it is not a sign of disrespect. In fact, it's perhaps disrespectfully done in practice, but it is intended as a sign of respect and care.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we're coming up on a solid hour, Bonnie. Thank you for all of your time, and thank you for what I gonna be honest. This is the first book that I think I've ever read about evangelicalism. Just
Really?
yeah, just
Ever?
never read any ever, just ever. But anyway, if you are listening or watching this later, then you should definitely pick up a copy. It's very good. It's a very courage laden book, and a very necessary book. Uh, just in light of kind of the cottage industry that has emerged around um, evangelical critique, evangelical like airing of laundry. So I think it's a really important book. I hope everybody gets to read. So
Thank you guys.
okay. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and go buy the book.
Good to be with you all. Thanks
All
for
right.
having me too.
Bye, guys.
Yeah.
Are we offline?